The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Mark. Jesus went up the mountain and summoned those whom he wanted, and they came to him. He appointed 12 whom he also named apostles, that they might be with him, and he might send them forth to preach and to have authority to drive out demons. He appointed the 12, Simon, whom he named Peter, James, son of Zebedee, and John, the brother of James, whom he named Boanerges, that is, sons of thunders, Andrew, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, Thomas, James, the son of Alphaeus, Thaddeus, Simon the Canaanian, and Judas Iscariot, who betrayed him. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
So last night I knew that the school would be here, and then early this morning I thought they would not be here, so I had prepared my homily differently. I preach to adults differently than students and children. So I had to make it kid-friendly, while it's still probably more of an adult homily on this day. I don't remember if it was last election or the previous one, but a priest made national news because after the election, he had asked any parishioners who had voted for a pro-abortion candidate, when there was the possibility to vote for someone who was not pro-abortion, he had strongly encouraged them to go to confession before they would receive Holy Communion, because they had just consciously, directly cooperated with the gravest evil in the history of the world, at least the greatest known evil. And he said one day humanity will look back on what has been done in our country with abortion with greater horror, more aghast than we look at the Holocaust, because of the number of lives claimed, and because they were innocent human lives, and because it had nothing to do with war. And when I read that about the priest encouraging his parishioners to go to confession if they had voted for a pro-abortion candidate when there was the possibility not to, I thought, wow, I hope he had prepared them. And I found out that he had been doing so for months, for weeks, for months, even for an entire year beforehand, properly forming the consciences of his parishioners. And some of them had come to him and they said, Father, I don't understand, but what if the other candidate is in favor of war at times? And other parishioners would say, well, what if the other candidate is in favor of the death penalty, or at least on occasion? And he said it's one of the greatest deceptions in our time that people equate those. And he said, my brothers and sisters, we do believe that there are times where war can be just, where we have a right to defend ourselves, or that there are causes that are just to fight against. And he said in recent wars for our country, how many human lives have been taken during those wars? He said it's in the thousands. He said how many lives have been claimed by abortion? It's nearly 50 million. There's no comparison. And he said, but also you're talking about innocent human life. And in regards to the death penalty, he said in 50 years, how many lives have been taken through the death penalty in our nation? He said hundreds. Maybe. He says, I don't even know the exact number, but it's not even over 1,000. And he said the people whose lives are being taken, he said, I'm not in favor of the death penalty. He said, but it doesn't compare to the abortion. And the people whose lives are claimed by the death penalty, they've done heinous, heinous crimes. I was reflecting on this morning, and it's interesting because growing up in this culture, it's amazing that we're so callous to abortion that we can just kind of talk about it like it's another thing. Like when I think back to the Holocaust, I say, oh my gosh, how did they do that? I didn't grow up thinking that way about abortion. It was just another thing. It's crazy how hard-hearted we can become living in such a culture. I just finished the book that I've been speaking of about the Italian woman, Chiara, who died from terminal cancer. She brought 2 children who she knew had deformities. She brought them to the fullness of life. They lived less than an hour, both of them, but she brought them to full term. And I close with this. She discovered in her 3rd pregnancy that she had terminal cancer. And at about 7 months along in the pregnancy, the doctor said, you know what, your child is probably safe. You know, there's no worry about any conditions that this little boy has. Your fetus will probably survive if we did a C-section, and then we can start to treat your cancer. You can go through chemotherapy. And she looked at the doctors and she said, well, okay, first, my fetus, he has a name. His name is Francesco. And he said, he's 7 months old, and you're telling me everything should be okay. She said, what mother would say, well, my child will probably be okay if I do this, so I should make sure and take care of myself. She said, no, I'm bringing my child to full term. People afterwards, she died within a year after her son was born. And people made comments to her husband and to the priest who was her spiritual director and said, gosh, it's so sad that she died because of Francesco. And her husband, he got to the point where he would get angry. He said, my wife did not die because of our son. She died to give life to our son. Why is abortion more anti-woman than anything else in the history of the world? Because there's nothing more innate in a woman than to protect the life of her child. Not just in the womb, but throughout their entire lives. I'm 36 years old. I can fight for myself. When somebody does something against me, my mom is ready to fight them. How much more ought that to be when a mother has a child in her womb? When her child is most vulnerable.